Welcome back to this series of lectures titled Our Living National Constitution, Its History and Evolving Interpretation. I am Edward J. Dodson. This is lecture 4 in this series titled Reform the American System or Replace It. Now, at the dawn of the 20th century, world opinion was aroused by a growing list of reformers, social scientists, journalists, aspiring public servants, and labor organizers, some of whom had come to embrace the principles embraced by Henry George, others influenced by the many advocates of socialist and progressive programs, as well as individualists who would one day forge the libertarian movement. In his damaging 1894 study entitled Wealth Against Commonwealth, Henry Demarest Lloyd captured the essence of the worsening inequality. That same year, he had run for a seat in the U.S. House of Representatives on the People's Party ticket. About the situation in the United States, he concluded, "Nature is rich, but everywhere man, the heir of nature, is poor. The world, enriched by thousands of generations of toilers and thinkers, has reached a fertility which can give every human being a plenty undreamed of even in the utopias. But between this plenty ripening on the boughs of our civilization and the people hungering for it, step the cornerers, the syndicates, trusts, combinations, with the cry of overproduction, too much of everything. Holding back the riches of earth, sea, and sky from their fellows who famish and freeze in the dark, they declare to them that there is too much light and warmth and food. They assert the right for their private profit to regulate the consumption by the people of the necessaries of life and to control production, not by the needs of humanity, but by the desires of a few for dividends." Frederick Lewis Allen reminds his readers that for many, the democracy was failing them, that the United States was no longer a welcoming frontier of opportunity. He writes, "There were hundreds of thousands of New Yorkers for whom the city was hardly a pleasant place in which to live, and in many other cities and industrial towns of America, the immigrant families were living under comparable conditions or worse. For at a time when the average wage earned in the United States got hardly $500 in a year, most of the newcomers to the country scrambled for far less. Labor organizers struggled to build membership and for the legal right to demand collective bargaining with employers. Some embraced the objective of cooperative ownership by workers. The nation's courts consistently ruled in favor of employers and against employee organization, based on the ostensibly laissez-faire idea of liberty of contract. Modern ultra-conservatives have resurrected the rationale as part of a strategy to dismantle the foundations of social democracy. However, Henry George had traced the origins of the concepts of laissez-faire to the French school of political economy known as physiocracy. In his final book, The Science of Political Economy, published after his death in 1897, Henry George attempted to correct the growing misrepresentation. The physiocrats were the authors of the motto that in the English use of the phrase laissez-faire, let things alone, has been so emasculated and perverted, but which on their lips was laissez-faire, laissez-aller. Clear the ways and let things alone. The English motto, which I take to come closest to the spirit of the French phrase, is a fair field with no favors. For the titans of American finance and industry, a fair field with no favors meant just law justly enforced, governmental regulation, and effective oversight. At the head of the nation's plutocracy sat J.P. Morgan, who in 1900 began negotiations with Andrew Carnegie to acquire Carnegie Steel. The United States Steel Corporation would then become the largest corporation in the world. Morgan seemed to feel untouchable, writes Frederick Lewis Allen. Morgan looked confidently forward to an era of stability and common sense in which political leaders would see that no foolish equalitarian ideas go anywhere in government, and in which the regulation of American business would be undertaken not by politicians, but by bankers like himself, honorable men of wealth and judgment, such as he liked to see in his favorite clubs. The courts pointed to the due process clauses of the Fifth and 14th Amendments and analogous provisions of state constitutions to void regulations of employment contracts concerning matters such as minimum wages, maximum hours, payment in scrip, and unionization. The plutocracy was winning, its privileges seemed secure. Roscoe Pound, dean of the Harvard Law School, led the attack on the liberty of contract perspective endorsed by the nation's courts. Pound considered the rulings cases of the distortions wrought by a misguided and antiquated understanding of law. As a result, he argued, the law could not be relied upon to advance the public interest. Professor Sitaraman adds this: the court's vision was rooted in the bygone economic assumptions of the prior age. Small artisans, like small landholders, had economic mobility. These changes in the American system were already in the works much earlier and were missed by Alexis de Tocqueville during his tour of the United States. He recorded his initial observations in Democracy in America, published in 1835. He wrote, "Amongst the novel objects that attracted my attention during my stay in the United States, nothing struck me more forcibly than the general equality of conditions. The gradual development of the equality of conditions is a providential fact, and it possesses all the characteristics of a divine decree. It is universal, it is durable, it constantly eludes all human interference, and all events, as well as all men, contribute to progress." Tocqueville came much closer to the truth when he observed this: there are many men of principle in both parties in America, but there is no party of principle. There were political men who embraced progressive principles. One was the senator from the state of South Dakota, Richard Pettigrew, who fought against the disposal of the public domain to land grabbers. In his memoirs, he detailed the corrupting influences over public land policies. The frauds thus deliberately ratified by Congress after all the facts were known caused me to wonder what forces were in control of the government, and convinced me that the lawyers who composed 2/3 of both houses of Congress were but the paid attorneys of the exploiters of the American people, and that both political parties were but the tools in the hands of big business that were used to plunder the American people. Looking back during the 1890s on his years of public service, Pettigrew reached a devastating indictment of the American system as it existed. I could form only one possible conclusion: that the power over American public life, whether economic, social, or political, rested in the hands of the rich. Plutocracy is a word that means rule by and for the rich. The United States is a country run by and for the rich. Therefore, it is a plutocracy. A social conscience was rising, and a report issued in 1890 by Jacob A. Riis in his book How the Other Half Lives sparked some action. His words were powerful, and they were reinforced by photographs that could not be ignored. Slowly building momentum against the plutocracy were reformers such as Eugene V. Debs, a former locomotive fireman who had led the Pullman strike of 1894, had been arrested, tried, convicted, and served a term in prison. By 1900, he had come to fully embrace socialism as the only effective response to plutocracy. He became the presidential candidate of the Social Democratic Party that year. The party, founded in 1898, was succeeded in 1901 by the Socialist Party of America. Over the next few decades, the party's candidates competed for local, state, and national offices. Meyer London and Victor Berger were elected to Congress from New York City and Milwaukee, Wisconsin, respectively. Eugene Debs stood as the party's candidate for President of the United States from 1900 to 1912. In that last election, Debs received 901,551 votes, 6% of the popular vote. Frederick Lewis Allen detailed the way the very wealthy lived as the new 20th century arrived. During the last 20 years of the 19th century, when a great many American millionaires had decided that the thing for a rich man to do was to build himself a princely mansion, it had been the Vanderbilt family who had set the pace for the rest to follow. By the middle 80s, there were no less than 7 great Vanderbilt houses within the space of 7 blocks on the west side of Fifth Avenue. Here are 2 photographs of just one of the mansions. Near Asheville, North Carolina, George W. Vanderbilt had a mansion built that contained 40 master bedrooms, a banquet hall, and a library containing over 250,000 volumes, an indoor swimming pool, and a bowling alley. The estate covered 203 square miles, where Vanderbilt employed a huge staff to engage in scientific farming and forestry. The plutocracy gained even more power because of the huge influx of immigrants into the nation's industrial cities. The world's first generation of formally credentialed economists wrote about supply and demand relationships and how the imbalance in labor markets favored employers who were able to keep wages down as workers competed with one another for employment at subsistence wages. This was just how economies functioned, they asserted. This was economic law at work as prices found their appropriate level when market forces did their job. A state of equilibrium then existed. The economists accepted their role as describers of how the economic world worked. To the extent they held views on its fairness and what changes ought to be pursued, that was outside of their defined role. Economics was not, they asserted, a prescriptive or normative science that aims at improving outcomes based on societal objectives or widely held principles of justice. In the real world of the early 20th century, low-income working people were also bled dry by absentee property owners who charged whatever the market would bring them for accommodations in run-down tenement housing. A good comparison of their circumstances is that of the sharecropper, except that the urban worker turned over cash rather than a crop. In 1906, Henry George Jr.'s book, The Menace of Privilege, was published. Many hoped his involvement would reignite a worldwide attack on landed privilege started by his father. His writing demonstrated he had acquired his father's intellect as well as a sincere concern for the fate of humanity. He wrote, "The effect of this highly unequal distribution must be manifold and marked. First of all, it divides the country into 2 general classes, the gainers and the losers, into the house of have and the house of want. Next, it causes broadly a lowering of public and private morals. The principle of aristocracy arises from the possession of privilege, and of all its forms, the ownership of land is the widest in extent, most potent, and most permanent. Even when the start is made from equality of condition, those who acquire large holdings and become the large land owners become the real ruling class, the possessors of other privileges swelling their numbers." Others expressed similar concerns, including former President Rutherford B. Hayes. "This is a government of the people, by the people, and for the people no longer. It is a government by the corporations, of the corporations, and for the corporations." At that very moment, even the very large manufacturing concerns were coming under the direct influence or even direct control of the world's financiers. Who was to run the U.S. Steel? Not someone with expertise in steel manufacturing, but J.P. Morgan and his top lawyer, Albert H. Gary. Gary was sufficiently powerful that the Indiana steel-producing town was named after him. Frederick Lewis Allen explains the power held by the bankers. I have said that in the age of unbridled capitalism, a company was run by the man who owned it, and he tended to be its personal proprietor. But unless he was overwhelmingly successful and also astute enough to plow his profits back into the property, there was one group of men to whom he stood in awe, the bankers. They commanded the credit he might need to tide him over lean seasons, and if he had to reorganize his company to sell bonds or stocks to investors, they had the power and prestige in the financial world to provide or deny a market for his securities. To command financial capital was even more important than to own tangible capital. Neither the United States government nor the state governments were a match for the corporations and the wealth they controlled in 1900. There was, as Frederick Lewis Allen reminds us, no Department of Commerce, no Department of Labor, no Federal Trade Commission, no Federal Reserve System. The reason was simple. Business was supposed to be no affair of the government's. It had an Interstate Commerce Commission, which was supposed to regulate the railroad companies, but the powers of the commission were small and uncertain. The staff of William McKinley, President of the United States at the time, consisted of 6 people. At the far left of this photograph is one Colonel William Crook of the Metropolitan Police assigned to protect presidents, beginning with Abraham Lincoln. Money flowed from wealthy corporate owners into the political campaigns, and in fact, raising funds for William McKinley, business owner and Ohio political insider Mark Hanna applied heavy pressure on those who would benefit by McKinley's politics, as explained by Professor Satterman. He made assessments of corporations based on their size and wealth, and he demanded a percentage of their overall capitalization. As one commentator wrote, Hanna shook down the business world for $2.5 million. Hanna once famously remarked, "There are 2 things that are important in politics. The first is money, and I can't remember what the second is." Meanwhile, around the nation, leaders who embraced reform were getting elected. For example, in 1901, Tom L. Johnson, one of Henry George's closest friends and supporters, was elected mayor of Cleveland, Ohio. Interviewed shortly after his election by James Creelan of the New York Journal, Johnson set down his goals. The 2 great steps which are necessary now lead to public ownership of municipal monopolies and the equalization of taxes. Vice in our great cities is largely the result of injustice, of involuntary poverty, the product of unequal conditions. The worst evils of municipal government and municipal politics are due to the struggle for valuable public franchises. That is the main source of corruption. When we have to put the street railway companies and other private owners of municipal monopolies out of politics, we have solved one of the most tremendous problems of city government. If I were mayor of New York, I would work to have the street railways and all other owners of city monopolies pay taxes on the full value of their property. This is what I have done here in Cleveland. Tax the possessions of the street railway companies on the basis of the selling value of their stock. It is worth noting that Louis F. Post, The Public, included coverage of Johnson's activities in nearly every weekly issue. In 1903, Johnson accepted his party's nomination for governor, but was badly defeated. Interviewed after the election results were in, he took the loss philosophically. While truth may lose some battles, it never lost a war. The man that lightly contemplates the overthrow of special privilege is surely short-sighted and reasons without either sufficient knowledge or careful consideration. There is no hope that the people will ever place their affairs in the hands of the Democratic Party as long as it is dominated by those who are opposed to the very principles for which democracy should and does stand. The pace of change in the world, and in the United States particularly, was accelerating as the first decade of the 20th century ended. The United States now had a military presence beyond its continental borders. The national government sought the means to increase revenue, and this came with the 16th Amendment proposed in 1909 and adopted in 1913. And with that, we've reached the end of Lecture 4.